Out of all the games that have been announced recently to get a sequel, Mortal Shell was not one on my bingo card. Funny enough, I actually planned to review this game back in 2022, but did not due to the overall just not really feeling like talking about it. Since the sequel was recently announced, I decided to give Mortal Shell a second look to see if there is something worth revisiting. For those who aren't aware, Mortal Shell is a Souls-like that was developed by Cold Symmetry and published by PlayStack. Currently, Mortal Shell sits at a 69% rating in Steam, which equates to a mixed score. With that said, is Mortal Shell being overlooked, or is it really just a mediocre title through and through? So when you start the game, you can pick a new game to begin your adventure properly. If you have the DLC, there is another mode available to you called the virtuous cycle. We will get into this later in the review. After an ominous cutscene, which is standard to the genre, we now begin our adventure as a naked man. Funny enough, I reviewed another Souls-like in 2020 called Hellpoint that started almost exactly the same way. Shout out in the comments section if you remember that one. Anyways, this serves as a tutorial as you get your first weapon, which is known as the Hollowed Sword. This is basically a two-handed sword with nothing really too noteworthy about it. We will get more into the weapons later. For a tutorial, it does a pretty good job getting you used to the control scheme as well as the expected formula of a Souls-like. After the tutorial is when you're dropped into the world to explore and find out your ultimate goal. Eventually, you will encounter your first shell. Each shell has its own stats as well as an ability tree tailored to a certain playstyle. While great in theory, there are two major flaws with this system. One, many of the abilities are so situational that they don't feel worth the grind to get them. Two, including the DLC which adds Hadern, there are only 5 shells to collect. The lack of variety reflects on the weapon variety as well. You can gain additional weapons by fighting Hadern at certain locations. Once again, there are only 5 weapons including the DLC weapon known as the Axe Katana, which is basically a katana that can turn into an axe, and vice versa. It kind of reminds me of the trick weapons in Bloodborne and is a ton of fun to play with. Unfortunately, this renders, at least to me, the other weapons useless once you obtain it, which shouldn't take that long if you know what you're doing. Combine this with the amount of shells in the game and there isn't really a ton of build variety, which ultimately hurts replayability for many people. You also have one ranged weapon to play with, which is honestly pretty baller to use. Just listen to it and enjoy. Since combat is going to be a majority of the game, how does it ultimately feel? Unfortunately, this is where I would like to classify this game as indie Souls. Games that feature indie Souls combat usually feature the following: enemies that constantly warp to you, inconsistent parry mechanics, and slow swings of almost any weapon. Despite the fact that I've beaten this game twice at this point, the combat never feels good. What you'll eventually figure out is each weapon has 1 or 2 really good moves and everything else is below average. For me, it was the sprinting strong attack with the katana that is really fast and does a surprising amount of high damage. Also, once you find a weapon that you want to stick with, feel free to upgrade it to the max once you're able to. While most on what's on offer for the combat is typical of most Souls-likes, I do like the harden ability that is given to you from the start. Essentially, you can harden your shell, making the next attack you take do no damage to you. This can be done even mid combos, which is a great way to catch enemies off guard. Out of all the combat mechanics in the game, this is one that feels the most enjoyable to use. Heck, I would say this is even necessary to use as the dodge can feel a bit wonky at times. So what exactly is the ultimate game flow? Without giving too much away, you learn that you need to gather these legendary souls from 3 separate bosses. These areas can be accessed from the main world, although finding them can be a pain for how samey everything looks. I will give Cold Symmetry credit though for at least diversifying the environments of the areas outside of the main one. One in particular has really cool imagery and looks awesome going through it. And now for what every Souls and Souls-like game is known for, and that is the boss battles. Regarding boss battles, Mortal Shell is a mixed bag. While I do enjoy the design of most of them, they feel a bit underwhelming. A majority of them have way too much health, even more so if you have not fully upgraded your weapon yet. The final boss especially is just an endurance test that isn't very enjoyable to go through. In most Souls-like, there's usually some sort of Estus flask replacement to use. Instead, Mortal Shell opts to go the Bloodborne route by having the player rely on limited consumables to get through the game. The problem is that there isn't really a single item to rely on. Instead, you'll need to find multiple items in the wild or purchase roasted rats from the one and only merchant in the game. There's also an alternative way to healing through with parrying, although this can only be used if you have enough resolve currently. Without resolve, you won't be able to parry your enemies. Resolve can be gained from damaging opponents as well as from certain items. I will say though, I do like how taking a certain item over and over again will allow you to become more familiar with it. This can even unlock hidden bonuses, which helps to encourage item utilization. Similar to the Souls series as well as many Souls-likes, Mortal Shell tries its hand at environmental storytelling by being mysterious for mysterious sake. If there is one common issue with many of these Souls-likes, is how insistent they are on this being the only way to convey a story. Just like many of these Souls-likes, the story becomes an afterthought as you slay each monster, wondering what the purpose of this all really is. Say what you want about Nioh and Nioh 2, but at least you knew what the hell was going on. There's also just a lack of quality of life improvements that we expect from the genre, even back in 2020. The biggest issue to me is the omission of fast traveling. Considering how samey the main area looks, this means that you'll have to memorize where exactly the main hub is for you to purchase items from the one freaking merchant. If there was fast travel to each of the 4 areas, it would cut down on the tedium and making getting tar, which is the game's currency, a far easier and less tedious process. According to howlongtobeat.com, Mortal Shell will take about 10.5 hours to complete. On my first playthrough, I clocked in a bit above this at 12.5 hours. For my second playthrough that I did for this review, it took me about 8 hours. 30 minutes to an hour has to be dedicated to that final boss, at least for being such a health sponge. Even compared to some of the DLCs for Dark Souls and Elden Ring, this is a painfully short time. Thankfully, there is an additional mode with the DLC that helps to address this game's lack of replay value. There is a roguelike mode called the Virtuous Cycle. It's basically you going through the game with one life, but with many added twists. For one, you'll have to collect instincts to power up your character during a playthrough. These can be found at pillars, which allows you to choose a bonus. There's also quite a bit to unlock in terms of starting bonuses in order to make future playthroughs much easier. While there isn't anything new in terms of enemies or areas to explore, it's a more enjoyable diversion for me, although many of the issues of combat still remain. Before I wrap this up, I just want to make a few comments on the presentation. Visually, it's very impressive for a Souls title with a lower budget. This was made on Unreal Engine 4, which looks better than most indie Unity games. Audio-wise is a mixed bag with incredibly over-exaggerated sounds and terrible mixing in some areas. The music is also pretty absent for the most part and overall forgettable. Overall, I really wanted to like Mortal Shell, but I just can't. There's quite a bit to like from a conceptual perspective, including the shells, the hardening mechanic, and the overall graphical design. Unfortunately, it suffers from many of the same issues that plague many of these Souls-likes, including unpolished combat, lack of build variety, and a painfully short experience. It's the classic case of trying to do too much, yet not really doing a lot with what you're given. Funny enough, I am actually looking forward to the sequel and seeing what the team can do better. We've seen a huge improvement from the Lords of the Fallen with its sequel / soft reboot, so maybe Cold Symmetry can deliver a much more enjoyable experience. For now, I can really only recommend this on a deep sale for 80% off, or more recently at 95% off. Mortal Shell is unfortunately just a shell of its mortal self. Thank you all for watching as always, and this is Powerhouse, signing off.